Welcome to Unlike-Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology.
A Most Considerate Vampire by James Dale Robinson. It was dark. Too dark to see until Raymond's eyes got used to it, certainly. And even then what lay before him were mere pools and pockets of dim light in the gloom. His mind dwelled on how hard it was to discern his surroundings, at first with an almost sleepy detachment, although that same dreamy feeling was fast giving way to panic upon realizing he had no idea where he was, nor how he'd gotten here. Oh, and his hands and feet were bound to the chair he was on. That certainly didn't help. "Hello?" he yelled. "Hello?" Silence. He struggled in the seat, hoping it was weak enough he might break free. But the chair had other intentions and remained resolute. "Please," he called out. "Please, where am I?" Still nothing. The smell of the room suggested he was below ground. The faint perfume of old paper and damp, although from the little he could see, no paper or wetness showed itself. There was also the mildest hint of old wine, perhaps a bottle left out and open, its aroma free to marry the air around it. Although no bottles were to be seen either, not in any areas of dim light the man peered into. It was as Raymond sat pondering what to do next that he suddenly became aware of a moving shape, little more than a vague, shifting darkness within the shadow at first, barely discernible as anything at all, but it was nevertheless just visible. "Hello?" he asked again, although this time in a warier tone. "Where am I?" A thought came to him. "Are you human?" It was a strange thing to add, to be sure, but the man suddenly wondered if this was merely a trick of his eyes. Are you real?" As if in response to this, the murky shape came forward slowly, entering into one pool of dim light, while in that same moment taking the shape of man. To Raymond, this other man coming into view seemed almost magical in the way he went from barely anything to the tangible figure now standing there. "Real," the new arrival answered. "Most certainly. And human, too, until recently." The new man was smartly dressed in a dark suit with an open shirt. His face was neither overly handsome nor unfavorable. He was tall and had a somewhat pale pallor, although Raymond wondered if this was merely due to the room lacking light. Oh, and from what he could see, the stranger's eyes were a bright, rich violet. "Who are you?" Raymond demanded. Now he had someone to direct his attentions, his tone became more adamant. He noticed he still retained some of his earlier calmness, despite his situation, although keeping a level head at all times was a trait he admired in himself, so he wasn't overly surprised by those feelings. "How did you appear like that? What do you mean when you said you weren't human?" "I'm not sure you deserve an answer, Raymond. In fact, I'm pretty certain. But I'll explain anyway what I've become." Raymond looked at his captor, who seemed to shimmer as he stood before him. To Raymond, it was almost like the wafting air you saw when looking through hot desert winds down a stretch of highway. Clear and yet not. Solid yet lacking substance. "So what have you become? You haven't told me." "Well, not to put too fine a point on it, I'm a vampire. My name is Cartwright." Raymond wasn't sure if he'd heard the man correctly. That's impossible. There's no such thing as vampires outside of books and films." "Yes, that's what I thought too, until I became one. No, in fact, there's quite a few, by all accounts, although I'm uncertain of the number. I was only turned recently, so I'm still trying to figure a lot of this out." "I'm still not convinced, Mr. Cartwright. Tell me more." Raymond said this with a smile, with the gentlest and most reassuring tone he could muster, realizing the best chance he had for this man, whether vampire or lunatic, was to talk him into a friendship, whereby he might go free. Although his veneer of calm was maintained, Raymond was aware of the sweat on the palms of his hands and the way his body was shaking. He wondered if it was evident to Cartwright. "Do you have fangs? I can't see in the dark." "Here," Cartwright said with a smile, by way of displaying them, revealing to Raymond that he did indeed have a pair, although on the smaller side. "They're not long, like in the movies," he explained. "But they're a little bigger with each day, or night, I should say. I'm hopeful they'll be quite magnificent before too long." An idea occurred to him. For further proof of what I say, perhaps this display will do. With that, Cartwright did a somewhat overly dramatic sweep of his arm, like a stage magician might, and vanished in a waft of black smoke, or perhaps more akin to vapor. A bat then appeared from this, and hovered in the air, flapping his wings before Raymond's astonished eyes. A moment more, and with another puff of black smoke, Cartwright stood before the seated man once again. Ta-da! Raymond wasn't sure what to say, or what kind of reaction Cartwright expected from him, so he took a gamble. His calm veneer stayed in place, and he graced their exchange with a gentle smile. "You don't seem very vampire-like. I mean, obviously I don't want to offend you when you have me tied up like this, but if you go by films and such, vampires seem so much more like vampires." A thought came to him. "By the way, it is you who's tied me up, right?" "Absolutely." "And, why, exactly?" "That would be jumping ahead. We'll get to that in a moment. Let me continue my explanation." Cartwright smiled back as if intending to keep the proceedings friendly, albeit with the admission that he was Raymond's captor. "I suppose my explanation begins with how I became what I am, which, as I just said, was a relatively recent thing. I must admit I'm quite excited if I can do this on my terms and not succumb to the cravings that are already proving a bit of a bane, but I'll get to that. Let's begin at the begin," he blithely continued with a chuckle. "God, he's acting like we're at a cocktail mixer," Raymond thought, still in shock by the very idea that Cartwright was indeed a vampire. This isn't just a vampire, he's insane to boot. Nevertheless, he smiled and feigned a chuckle back while subtly struggling with the ropes binding his wrists to the chair. "Please," he said, "enlighten." "It began when I changed into what I am now. Turned, I think the term is, if what you see in films is in any way accurate. I was walking home from the cinema, in fact, when it happened. Walking from the car to my apartment. Funny, if I'd found a place closer or paid extra every month for a space in the downstairs parking, it might not have happened at all. As it was, I had to park 3 blocks from the house because of the late hour." "What was the movie?" "Keep him talking. Keep him engaged." "You know, it wasn't long ago at all, but after everything that's happened since, I don't recall." Cartwright looked off in thought, his expression suddenly sad, or so it seemed to Raymond looking on. "What's wrong?" Cartwright shook his head briskly as if casting off whatever thoughts he'd had. "So, I was walking home when the vampire descended upon me from above. I can't say too much about what happened next, as it was all so quick. In fact, I can barely recall it any more than the film that night. I felt his fangs in my neck and almost immediately drifted into a sort of..." The vampire paused as if choosing the right word. "Half sleep. More than a daze, certainly. I was in that state as he dragged me to the ground, still sucking the blood from me." Cartwright paused to reflect again on the memory of that night. "It must have been terrifying," Raymond said, still attempting to bond with the vampire in some way. "Actually, it wasn't. I was just thinking about that very thing, in fact. No, it was strange how I didn't feel fear or pain, for that matter. It was more a vague elation, actually, bordering on bliss. In hindsight, I can tell you when a vampire takes your life, there are certainly worse ways to go. The oddest part was that my blood seems to be almost alive. As he drew it out of me, I could feel it as it left my body, totally unlike anything I've ever experienced. Raymond nodded, as if rapt by the telling, while at the same time realizing he finally had some give in the ropes around his wrists. And I certainly would have died, too, blissfully, yes, but still gone forever. But at that moment, luck stepped in. You'll be relieved to know that vampire hunters are a real thing, too. It makes sense if you think about it. If vampires are a thing, so are their enemies, right? Raymond nodded again while meeting Cartwright's gaze as a way to keep the vampire from noticing his ankles twisting against the ropes, too. So it was then, while I was close to death, but still alive, barely, that a vampire hunter who'd been trailing my attacker chose this moment of distraction to come up from behind and stake him. I'm pretty sure you've seen it in films and television, how a vampire's body with a stake in it would explode into a big, messy spray of blood everywhere. Well, that pretty much is how it is in reality. Blood everywhere, big mess. Cartwright paused, reliving the moment. And further to my luck that night, I was lying there with my mouth open like you'd imagine a dazed, stunned person would. Because of that, the vampire's blood, and a good amount too, got into my mouth and down my throat. That's how you get turned, if you didn't know. You get drained of your blood until there's barely any in your body, and then you drink the blood of that same vampire before death takes you. Of course, I didn't know that at the time, and luckily the vampire hunter didn't see that it had happened. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have staked me too as I lay there. So what? You sprang up and flew away? No. Cartwright seemed surprised Raymond would even come to that conclusion. At the moment, all went black in my mind. This was my last moment alive. I woke up later at the morgue, naked with a sheet over me, having experienced anything like that since college. Anyway, I was alive, or whatever passes for it with my kind, and I knew instinctively that I shouldn't be. I suppose I knew I was a vampire, or on my way to being one at least. Didn't take long to confirm it when I looked at myself in the mirror and couldn't see my reflection. That almost made me hit the ground once more from the shock of it all, but as I say, I sort of realized what had happened to me. I was in a morgue, obviously. I guess I'd seemed dead to whoever found me, the cops, I mean. So this is where I'd found myself. I also knew I was lucky they hadn't done an autopsy, although I know it sometimes takes a day or two until they get around to someone, depending on how busy the coroner is at the time. So, what did you do? I found some clothes in a storeroom that I suppose were from other dead people. No idea where mine went, but I guess they'd be covered in blood anyway. So pants and a jacket, needed a belt to keep the pants up, and the jacket didn't fit much better, but it at least meant a naked man wasn't sneaking about. I got out a side entrance, and then I just looked like a weird, homeless guy. Is this boring you? Raymond had been focused on freeing his leg and wrists, all having loosened just enough. He had hope of escape if he kept at it, but upon Cartwright's words, he locked eyes with the vampire again, as if rapt with attention at the story being told. How could I be? Raymond answered. A vampire's origin story. Incredible. Origin story? You made me sound like a superhero, and I think we can agree I'm far from that. Well, you have amazing powers, don't you? Cartwright stared off for a moment in thought, the violet of his eyes seeming to darken slightly as he considered Raymond's words. I think superheroes are defined by their actions, not their powers. The vampire turned back to Raymond and looked into his eyes for more than a moment, as if he was pondering not just his prisoner's words, but the man himself. There was sadness on his face, or was it more anger? Raymond was unsure, and certainly too scared to ask. Anyway, Cartwright said finally, his mood seeming to lift again as swiftly as it had waned. Where was I? Raymond was about to tell him, but Cartwright quickly recollected and continued his story. I had no shoes, and with the morgue on the other side of the city, I feared for my feet, from both the hard streets and the night's cold. But at the same time, having realized what I now was, I knew I had to get home before sunrise. I set off walking as fast as I could, and without even noticing it, my brisk walk became an even brisker trot, and then a truly rapid sprint. My feet felt no pain at all, and I realized I'd made the distance home, which I'd estimated might take me at least an hour, probably closer to 2, in little more than 10 minutes. That was the first instance I saw that being a vampire perhaps wasn't quite as bad as you'd think. I got into my apartment thanks to my building's front door lock needing repair, lucky me again, I suppose, but then found that my apartment door was unlocked too. It had been searched, I assume, by the police, who got my name and details from my wallet when they found me. I suppose to them I was an apparent homicide, although with my wallet on me as it was, not a robbery, so what? And I would have been found lying there dead, covered in blood, but not mine, the vampire, so there was that too. Yes, it must have been quite a mystery. So, he looked around, excuse me, and rose, walking over to a shadowy corner, only to return a moment later with an old wooden chair, not unlike the one Raymond unwillingly sat on. He took another moment of silence, looking squarely in Raymond's eyes. I have so much energy now, I no longer need to sit in order to rest, he continued finally. I do miss the sensation, though. He sighed. Anyway, I realized if I was a murder victim, it was only a matter of time until the apartment was cleared out and re-rented, not to mention the distinct possibility that the police might return to look into my life again. It's good to think of any and all eventualities, Raymond said, nodding his head while beginning to feel the rope around his wrists was actually starting to loosen. Not enough to get free, no, not yet, but enough that he resolved his strategy to look, nod, and appear the vampire's avid listener until he was in a position to make a break for it, to be the best strategy for surviving. I knew the apartment 2 doors down from mine was vacant for the next week while the tenant, Gloria, nice woman, was away in Europe with her job. I took what I needed from my own place, clothes mainly, and relocated there as quickly as I could. I needed to think, to plan for whatever my strange new existence had in store. How did you get in? Wasn't the door locked? Oh, I knew where she'd hidden a spare set of keys in one of those little magnetic cases attached to the wheel well of her car in the car park downstairs. Luckily, she thought the extra money for a space was worth it. Lucky, too, that I wasn't seen, actually running up and down dressed as I was. Lucky it was late at night. Cartwright paused. Lucky, he said again, recalling the moment. Actually, it was barely night at all. So just as I entered Gloria's home, I felt the first rays of dawn rising over the buildings and shining in, so faint, barely anything at all. And yet what I felt in that instant was a truly uncomfortable heat. Obviously, I knew about vampires and sunlight not being friends, but if this was just the beginning of dawn, I can't imagine how a bright mid-morning would feel. So what did you do? Well, I closed the blinds, of course, although they immediately seemed inefficient as Gloria hadn't spent a lot on them. They let in a good amount of light, in fact. So then what did you do? Well, with the dawn came an overwhelming weariness. I don't recall ever feeling so tired. So I shut myself in a closet for the day and slept the sleep of the dead. Undead, I suppose. Raymond had long since stopped wondering how his capture played into this saga, accepting his role as its unwilling audience, although the story's length was a boon in that it allowed him to work at his bonds, of which the movement and give he was beginning to feel gave him a growing sense of hope. Not that there wasn't a good amount of terror in heart at the same time. A vampire is a vampire, after all. I awoke hours later with a ravenous hunger. Cartwright continued. I knew what I needed, obviously. Human blood, what else? I quickly donned clothing that didn't make me stand out and left the apartment without any real plan for how I was going to feed, only driving desperation. However, it was as I left Gloria's that the solution presented itself, namely the detective investigating my murder. He'd been back to my apartment, as I guess someone might, and was just leaving again at the same time as me. He identified himself and asked who I was. I told him I was Gloria's brother, keeping an eye on the place while she was away. He then asked me if I'd seen or heard anything unusual here in the last couple of days involving me. Hold on, Raymond interjected, becoming intrigued by this part of the story despite his own dire situation. Didn't he recognize you? He saw your body. Good point. But there were two factors in play. One was that as far as murdered me was concerned, I was lying dead in the morgue at that moment, so yeah, I was lucky again, I guess, that my disappearance hadn't been noted yet by whoever was working there, which meant the detective didn't know. The other reason I'll get to presently, as it will get in the way of the story if I tell you now. Sure, sorry. Sorry for what? I'm glad you're following along so well. Raymond was surprised by the vampire's tone, seemingly cheerful and friendly, and almost asked him what his intentions were then and there, but decided that caution was still the path to take. It was while I was trying to get by the detective, telling him I'd let him know if anything occurred to me, that I'd thought about vampires in general, and so about myself. I've seen in some films and such how they could put people in a thrall and get them to say or do whatever that vampire wanted. I stared into his eyes, a deep, penetrating gaze. He mumbled something about my violet eyes, then fell into a semi-daze while standing before me. Would you mind raising your left arm? I asked. It was a gamble, sure. But in that moment I sensed that I was right in thinking that I could thrall. And I was. The detective raised his arm high like a child in school eager to answer teacher's question. Now, give me your gun. He did so without question, and even as I handed the gun back, I was forming a plan. We drove in his car to the precinct, and I waited until he did as I'd instructed him. And what was that? To retrieve my wallet, my Apple Watch and phone, and anything else of mine that might lead the police back to me in the future. I also told him to erase my murder from their files, and if that wasn't possible due to backups and such, I have no idea how police computers are set up, then he should at least enter me as a John Doe with no clues to my identity. And that worked? I'm still in my apartment, so yes. Thicker curtains, but the same place. Cartwright remembered something. Oh, and that brings me to the other reason the detective didn't recognize me. You asked about that a moment ago? Yes? The detective mentioning my violet eyes got me wondering, as they certainly weren't that color before I was turned. In fact, they were a remarkably drab, unflattering shade of brown. So once I sent the detective on his way with the final last thrall that he forgot me and everything about the case, I had the idea to use my phone that I just had returned. Your phone? Yes, I've no idea how vampires got on in the time before phones and video recorders when they were unable to see their own reflections, but I simply took a selfie. To my surprise, my eyes were now violet, my facial features slightly slimmer and more delicate. I think it's as simple as by being turned means I burn more calories, and so I lost some body fat. I was certainly still the same, though. It wasn't some magical transformation, I just looked better somehow. And speaking of burning more calories, my hunger by this point was so severe, I almost attacked the detective. But you didn't. I thought vampires were pretty ruthless and uncaring when it came to where they got their blood. Yeah, me too. I thought vampires lost their consciences when they got their fangs. I say that as a joke, of course. I'm glad I haven't been turned into a true monster, although anyone not knowing me might think so. Still, the fact is I abhor murder. So the idea I might have to begin taking innocent people's lives was a terrible thing to me. I have to assume that the vampires who do kill for blood were either lacking in conscience to begin with or without the smarts or the inclination to think of an alternative. But you have, I take it? Yes and no. Cartwright paused yet again, looking into Raymond's eyes with his own piercing violet. First thing I did was go to the hospital over on the south side. I know. I thralled a nurse who directed me to where the blood is kept. I thralled another nurse there, and she gave me a good supply. In fact, I'd bought a big cooler on the way there, which I filled with plastic packs of blood. So it was a very good supply indeed, enough for several months, after I'd cleared out my refrigerator and experimented with how much I'd need every day. Cartwright paused again, allowing himself a little smile. After that, I spent my time learning how to be a better vampire, transforming into dogs and bats, flying when I am a bat, harder than you'd think at first, let me tell you, thralling with more confidence, and learning to adjust to increased senses, I didn't expect that part of it. Having your sight and smell and hearing increase over the first few weeks comes as a bit of a shock. I used to wear glasses. Raymond's bonds weren't quite loose enough for him to get free of them, but close to it. He just needed a little while longer. He decided to take a chance and ask the question he'd wanted the answer to from the beginning. Why am I here? If you have blood and you don't want to kill people, what's my part in all this? No, I was just getting to that, funnily enough. You see, when I'd almost run out of my blood supply, I returned to the hospital for more. However, when I got there, a different nurse I thralled told me that the one from before was fired after the missing blood was noted, and the poor girl had no explanation for how it was gone. I felt terrible. I decided I wouldn't take any more from hospitals for the sake of innocent nurses having to answer impossible questions, as well as the fact that blood is needed for emergencies, and I felt bad taking it for that reason too. Cartwright looked off, a recollection in mind. It occurred to me I could take blood from bad men and women, but how to go about finding them? Prostitutes and drug dealers are easy enough to find. Prostitutes aren't villains. I certainly don't see them as evil. I never have. As for dealers, I'm uncertain where I fall in terms of drugs, so I'm not sure I consider them evil or not. He wiped a hair off his forehead that had fallen down. I considered end of life, old people, giving them a blissful death after whatever they'd gone through up to that point. But I've known enough people with cancer or wasting diseases who enjoyed their last moments surrounded by loved ones, so who was I to deny them that? But then I had an idea. Yes? Alzheimer patients. They don't know anything at the very end. There's no loving goodbye. They've already stopped being who they are. I could visit them in hospices and such, drink their blood, and their loved ones would be told they died peacefully in their sleep. An excellent plan. I'm glad you like it. I even had a first example to try this out on a woman who worked at the same library that I used to. She and her husband were looking after her mother, and the old woman was in her last stages. I thought her being at a single home without nurses and people visiting would make for good practice. I went to the house and reacquainted myself with the woman. We'd been friendly at the library, so it was easy to say I was dropping by to see how they were getting on, except they weren't getting on at all. Not well, not happily, not even as happily as a family with a dying mother sitting upstairs could hope for. What was wrong with them? I'm not following you. Raymond could feel his bindings were finally loose enough he could get free. So now all he needed was the right moment. He listened, ready for any distraction. Their son was missing. 8 years old, snatched off the street. Raymond stopped pulling at his bonds. Yes, he'd better listen to this bit. The thing is, or was, I could smell the boy's scent in the house. Not that he was there, but my senses are more acute now. I told you that, didn't I? Yes, you did. I couldn't bear to see the couple like that in such pain and worry. When I see someone hurting, I want to help. Not a good trait for a vampire, I admit, but I am who I am. Anyway, I excused myself and I followed the boy's scent through the air, flying and landing and sensing and flying, until I found the house where he'd been imprisoned. Cartwright stood at that moment, glaring down at his captive. Your house, Raymond. Raymond swallowed. You were coming home from work when I got there. I thralled your wife and put her to bed. I thralled you, brought you here. Although I doubt you have memory of it, we're in the basement of a deserted house I chanced upon in my bat-flying travels, by the way. Oh, and speaking of basements, I found my ex-colleague's son chained up in yours. I sent him home, and I'm sure he's with his relieved parents by now. What were you going to do with him? Raymond was unable to look away from Cartwright's violet eyes. He felt giddy and dazed and knew he was being thralled again. He was unable to lie. I was going to kill him. It brings me a joy like nothing else, in fact. Let me tell you how. That's plenty, Cartwright interrupted. I don't need details. But that's why I've told you all this, he added. I felt it was the right thing to let the very first person I intend to kill by drinking their blood how they arrived at these last moments of their life and why. Those words were enough for Raymond, who, determined to escape, made a sudden dash now his bonds were free. However, Though Raymond was fast, Cartwright was faster, moving like a blur. He snatched Raymond back off his feet and, dragging him to the ground, proceeded to kill him exactly the way he said he would. It took time until Cartwright was sated and Raymond dead. One less bad man, Cartwright thought as he got to his feet. Bad men. It'll certainly keep it interesting, the hunting part, if I'm going to live forever. And I certainly enjoy the notion that, although I'm a vampire, I'm not a monster. Cartwright looked down at Raymond's body and realized he felt nothing for the fact he'd taken this man's life. Perhaps that's the piece of my humanity I've lost. Perhaps. He shrugged at his own question, then turned into a bat and flew away.
This has been Unlike Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology. Collection 3, Monster Mash, stories about creatures, chaos, and the supernatural. A Most Considerate Vampire was written by James Dale Robinson and narrated by Jonathan Cake. Unlike Minded is an August year-round production, created, produced, and edited by Robbie Hyne. We'd like to give a special thank you to everyone who has supported this independent podcast production. You can keep up to date and find more info about this podcast and others on Instagram at the handle AugustYearRoundProd, or email us at augustyearround@gmail.com. And be sure to subscribe, leave a rating and review, and tune in next week for another episode of Unlike Minded. Thank you for listening.